Right now, there's a constraint on silver supply that almost nobody in the precious metals space is paying attention to. And it's not because it's hidden, it's because understanding it requires looking at an entirely different industry, the copper industry. The biggest threat to silver supply over the next 5 to 10 years isn't a shortage of silver ore. It's a shortage of copper mines. And if you understand why, you understand something about silver's future that most investors are completely blind to. Here's the uncomfortable truth. 70 to 75% of global silver production comes as a byproduct of mining other metals, primarily copper, but also zinc, lead, and gold. Silver is not mined for silver. It's mined because it comes along with something else. You dig up copper, you process it, and silver comes out of the refining process. That's where most of the world's silver comes from, and that creates a constraint. Silver supply is not determined by silver prices or silver demand. It's determined by decisions made in copper mines based on copper economics. Think about what that means. If copper prices fall, copper mining slows down. Less copper mined means less byproduct silver. Silver supply contracts even if silver prices are high. Conversely, if copper demand explodes, copper mining accelerates and silver supply rises as a byproduct. But here's where it gets interesting. Right now, we're in a moment where copper demand is being driven by something specific: the energy transition, electric vehicles, renewable energy infrastructure, grid modernization. All of those things require massive amounts of copper, and that demand is starting to strain global copper supply. The world is facing a potential copper shortage, not immediately, but over the next 5 to 10 years. As electrification accelerates and EV adoption grows, copper demand is going to exceed copper supply. Mines are being depleted. New mine development is slow. Ore grades are declining. The easy copper has already been mined. What's left requires more capital, more time, and faces more environmental and regulatory hurdles. Now, here's where silver enters the story. If the world is moving into a copper deficit, if copper mining doesn't keep pace with copper demand, then byproduct silver production is going to be constrained by copper mining decisions, not by silver market dynamics. China is going to need more copper for its EV production. The US is going to need more copper for grid modernization and renewable infrastructure. Europe is going to need more copper as part of its transition. All of that copper demand is going to compete with each other. Mining companies are going to prioritize copper extraction. They're going to process ore faster. They're going to seek higher grade deposits. They're going to push for new mine permits. And all of that copper-focused activity will generate silver as a byproduct. But it's copper demand driving it, not silver demand. That creates a peculiar situation. Silver demand could be skyrocketing, the silver-to-gold ratio could be flashing buy signals, industrial consumption could be at records, but if copper mining doesn't accelerate enough to match copper demand, silver supply gets constrained by a different supply chain entirely. It's not a silver supply problem, it's a copper mining problem, and that's a distinction with enormous implications. Let me break down the current state of the copper market because this is foundational to everything else. Global copper reserves are estimated at around 2 billion tons. That sounds like a lot. It's not. At current consumption rates, at current mining rates, those reserves are being drawn down. The world produces roughly 20 to 21 million tons of copper annually. That's been relatively stable for years, but demand is accelerating. EV makers alone are going to need significantly more copper per vehicle than traditional cars. A Tesla Model 3 uses roughly 60 pounds of copper. A conventional car uses about 50 pounds. But the growth in EV production is going to multiply that demand exponentially. The International Energy Agency has done research on this. For the world to reach net zero emissions by 2050, copper demand is going to roughly double from current levels. That's not gradual, that's aggressive. And on the supply side, we're not seeing commensurate mining expansion. Why? Multiple reasons. First, permitting. Opening a new mine takes years, sometimes a decade or more. Environmental reviews, community consent, regulatory approval. In developed countries, that process is lengthy and uncertain. In developing countries where the best copper deposits are located, political instability creates risk. Mining companies don't commit capital to projects that might be expropriated or caught in geopolitical crossfire. Second, ore grades are declining. The copper that's easy to mine, that's high grade and close to the surface, has been mined already. What's left requires processing vastly more ore to extract the same amount of copper. That means higher costs, more energy consumption, and more environmental impact. A mine that could profitably operate at ore grades of 1% copper 20 years ago now requires 0.5% grades. That's twice as much ore to mine for the same output. That's a constraint. Third, water constraints. Copper mining is water intensive. Climate change is making water scarcer in key mining regions. Peru, one of the top copper producers, faces water scarcity and has had mining disruptions due to community protests over water rights. Chile, another top producer, is facing similar issues. The largest copper mine in the world, Escondida in Chile, faced strikes and water shortages. As water becomes scarcer and more politically sensitive, mining operations face bottlenecks. Fourth, energy costs. Mining and refining copper is energy intensive. As energy becomes more expensive, as regulatory pressure on carbon emissions increases, mining economics become tighter. High energy costs cut into margins. Some marginal operations become uneconomical. Production slows. Fifth, geopolitical risk. A significant portion of global copper is mined in countries with political instability or uncertain regulatory environments. Peru, Chile, Congo, Indonesia, Russia. Geopolitical tension, supply chain concerns, and ESG pressures are all creating friction in the copper supply chain. Now here's where this connects back to silver. If copper mining doesn't expand to meet growing demand, if production plateaus or declines, then byproduct silver supply is constrained. You can't get more silver without more copper mining, and there's no substitute. You can't just decide to mine more silver to compensate. The geology doesn't work that way. Silver is where it is, embedded in copper ore. You mine the copper, the silver comes along. So picture this scenario. It's 2028. Global EV production has accelerated. The world is pushing hard on renewable energy. Copper demand is surging, but copper production is only up 5% from 2024 levels because permitting delays have pushed back 3 major new mines. A Chilean operation is dealing with water restrictions, and an Indonesian mine faced political disruptions. Meanwhile, silver demand for electronics, solar, EVs is at record levels. Industrial fabricators are desperate for silver. But byproduct silver production is up only 5%, matching the copper increase. There's a structural gap between what the market needs and what's available. Prices move. Now, I want to be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying copper mining will stagnate completely. I'm not saying the world will run out of copper. Mining companies will adapt. Some new mines will open. Some operations will become more efficient. What I'm saying is that expansion is going to be constrained by factors outside the control of the silver market. And that constraint is going to create a supply ceiling on silver that's independent of silver prices or silver fundamentals. This is already starting to play out. Global copper mine production growth has been minimal over the past 5 years. We're not seeing explosive expansion. We're seeing flat to low single-digit growth. Meanwhile, copper demand is accelerating. That gap is tightening. And as it tightens, the question becomes not just how much copper will be produced, but will enough copper be produced to generate the byproduct silver the market needs? Here's what makes this problem specific to silver. If you needed more gold, you could open more gold mines. Gold mining is an industry unto itself. When gold prices are high, capital flows to gold exploration and development. New mines get built. Supply responds. But silver doesn't work that way. You can't open a silver mine in response to silver prices. The incentives don't align. A mining company is going to develop a copper deposit based on copper economics, not silver economics. Silver is a bonus, not the driver. This creates what I call the byproduct trap. Silver supply becomes hostage to copper economics. When copper is cheap, copper mining slows down and silver supply contracts. When copper is expensive, copper mining accelerates and silver supply expands. But silver prices don't directly control that lever. Silver traders, silver investors, even central banks interested in silver, they can't change the incentive structure. The incentive structure is set by copper. Now you might ask, couldn't mining companies prioritize silver recovery from copper mining? The answer is partially yes, but with limits. You can improve recovery rates, you can optimize processing, but there are physical constraints. The amount of silver and copper ore varies widely. Some ores are silver rich, some are silver poor. If you're mining in a region with low silver content ore, no amount of processing optimization is going to dramatically increase silver recovery. You're extracting what's there. And here's another wrinkle. Environmental regulations are increasingly stringent around mining. Processing ore for maximal silver recovery can require additional chemical steps, additional water usage, additional energy. As environmental standards tighten, some of those recovery optimizations become uneconomical. You're trading silver recovery for environmental compliance. In a regulatory environment that's tightening around mining, that trade-off often goes against silver recovery. Let me connect this to the current market moment. We're in a period where copper prices are elevated. That's driving copper mining expansion in some regions. New mines are ramping up. That's generating more byproduct silver. But those mines are being developed based on copper economics that might not persist. If copper prices fall, if EV adoption slows, if renewable energy deployment disappoints, copper mining economics change. Some of those marginal operations become uneconomical. Production slows, and byproduct silver follows. Conversely, if copper demand surges ahead of mining expansion, if a genuine copper shortage develops, copper prices spike. That creates margin for copper miners. They expand operations, push for faster permitting, optimize existing mines. That generates more byproduct silver. But all of that happens on copper's timeline, not silver's timeline. What this means for silver investors is that the supply-demand story is more complex than it might appear. You can look at silver industrial demand and see it's at record levels. You can look at COMEX inventory and see it's falling. You can look at Chinese demand and see it's surging. All of that points to tightness. But the question of whether supply will respond to that tightness isn't determined by silver markets. It's determined by copper markets and copper mining decisions. Now, I want to talk about what could change this dynamic. One scenario is primary silver mining expansion. If silver prices stayed elevated for long enough, if the economics became compelling enough, if permitting and regulatory environments became favorable enough, mining companies might develop deposits that are silver primary rather than copper primary. But that takes years, sometimes a decade, and it requires silver prices to be materially higher than they are now to justify the capital commitment. We're not there yet. Another scenario is major technological breakthroughs in copper mining efficiency or in copper to EV conversion efficiency. If EVs could be made with significantly less copper, if battery technology changed the copper intensity of vehicles, that would reduce copper demand. That would reduce mining pressure, but it would also reduce byproduct silver, so that's not necessarily bullish for silver. A third scenario is copper substitution. If other materials could substitute for copper in electrical applications, in solar infrastructure, in EV motors, that would reduce copper demand. But realistically, there's no substitute at scale for copper's combination of electrical conductivity, thermal conductivity, malleability, and cost. It's going to be the dominant metal for electrification infrastructure for decades. The most likely scenario, in my view, is that copper supply constraints become material within 5 to 10 years. Demand grows faster than mining can expand. Prices rise. Mining becomes more profitable. Capital flows to copper. Some new mines open. Some expansion happens. But it's constrained, it's slower than ideal, and throughout that entire process, silver supply is being determined by copper market dynamics, not silver market dynamics. What that means for silver prices is important. It means that silver upside is potentially capped by copper supply constraints if those constraints bite before silver demand moderates. It also means that the time to accumulate silver is now, before copper constraints become acute. Once copper supply really tightens, once copper prices are visibly strained, investors are going to be scrambling for copper exposure. Mining companies are going to shift focus entirely to copper optimization. And silver, as a byproduct, is going to be supply constrained in ways that don't directly benefit from higher silver prices. The copper mining problem isn't a silver story yet. It's a copper story. But it's a copper story with major silver implications. And very few people in the silver space are thinking about it. They're focused on COMEX inventory, on Shanghai premiums, on ETF flows. Those are all real. But they're missing the deeper constraint, which is that silver supply is ultimately limited by copper mining decisions made based on copper economics. If you're sitting in silver, understanding this gives you a different framework for thinking about your time horizon. You're not just betting on silver tightness in the next 1 or 2 years. You're betting on a longer cycle structural constraint that plays out over 5 to 10 years. That kind of setup rewards patience, rewards accumulation, and rewards understanding that sometimes the most important constraints in a market aren't visible in that market's data, they're visible in a different market entirely. Thanks for watching. If this analysis was useful, I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe. Understanding the second and third order effects of market structure is what separates good analysis from great analysis. And in precious metals, that kind of thinking matters. See you in the next one.